Greetings, dear listener. Subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new scary stories and support me with a like. Enjoy listening.
I still remember my first day at university like it was yesterday. The excitement, the anxiety, and the sense of adventure all rolled into one. It was a new chapter of my life that I was eager to explore. However, I had no idea what awaited me. As I walked into the lecture hall, I was met with a sea of unfamiliar faces. The professor strolled in, and the class began. I found myself struggling to keep up with the pace, and the assignments were daunting. However, I persevered, determined not to fail. As the semester progressed, I met a group of friends who shared the same struggles and aspirations. We had fun together, and we were there to support each other through thick and thin. We would stay late in the library trying to understand the material, and we would celebrate each other's successes. One day, something peculiar happened. I was studying alone in the library, and I started to feel like I was being watched. It was as if someone was breathing down my neck. I turned around, but there was no one there. I shrugged it off as my imagination and continued studying. However, the feeling persisted. Every time I was alone in the library, the sensation of being watched would consume me. I started to dread going to the library, and my grades began to suffer. My friends noticed the change in me and tried to help, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what was happening. One night, I made a mistake. I stayed in the library past closing time, and the janitor had to usher me out. As I walked down the empty hallway, I felt a presence behind me. I turned around, and to my horror, I saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. I tried to run, but it was too late. I was dragged into the darkness, and I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. My friends were there, and they told me that I had been missing for days. I tried to tell them what had happened, but the words wouldn't come out. I was too traumatized by what I had experienced. It was only later that I found out the truth. The university was built on an ancient burial ground that had been disturbed during the construction. The spirits of the dead were angry and vengeful, and they preyed on unsuspecting students who stayed in the library past closing time. I was lucky to survive. From that day on, I never stayed in the library past closing time again. I never thought that my university experience would be so terrifying. As a freshman, I was excited to start this new chapter in my life. I had heard tales of wild parties, new friends, and prestigious academic achievements. Little did I know, a sinister force was waiting for me at the university. It all started when I moved into my dorm room. The place was old and creaky, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell. I tried to make it feel like home by adding some pictures and decorations, but something about the room made me uneasy. At night, I would hear strange noises coming from the walls, like scratching and whispering. I chalked it up to my imagination and tried to get some sleep. But the nightmares began soon after. Every night, I would dream of a dark figure watching me from the corner of my room. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, and I could hear its ragged breathing. I would wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like something was watching me even when I was awake. My grades started to suffer as I struggled to stay awake in class. One day, I met a group of students who were interested in paranormal activity. They invited me to join them in exploring the abandoned buildings on campus. I was hesitant at first, but something drew me to their enthusiasm. We met up at midnight and sneaked into an old laboratory that had been sealed off for years. As soon as we entered the dark room, I felt like we were being watched. The air was thick with dust and cobwebs, and the silence was oppressive. Suddenly, one of the group members let out a scream. We all turned to see her being dragged by an unseen force towards the wall. We tried to pull her back, but it was like she was being sucked into another dimension. Her screams echoed through the empty room, and we could hear a sinister laughter coming from the shadows. We ran out of the building as fast as we could, but the terror followed us. Every night, I could feel the dark figure getting closer and closer to me. It would whisper my name in a ghostly voice, promising to take me to its realm. I started to see the figure in broad daylight, lurking in the corners of my vision. I knew that I had to do something before it was too late. I went to the university library and started researching the history of the campus. I found out that the laboratory we had explored was built on the site of an old cemetery. The bodies had been exhumed and relocated, but it seemed like some of them had never left the place. There were rumors of a cursed object that had been buried there, and that it had been the cause of many disappearances over the years. I knew what I had to do. I went back to the laboratory, armed with salt and holy water. I sprinkled the salt in a protective circle around me and held the holy water in one hand. I called out to the dark figure, challenging it to show itself. It appeared in front of me, its eyes glowing with malevolent glee. But I was ready for it. I threw the holy water at it and it screamed in agony. It tried to reach me, but the salt circle kept it at bay. It faded away into nothingness, leaving behind a sinister laughter that echoed through the laboratory. I knew that the curse had been lifted and that I could finally sleep in peace. Now, as I look back on my university experience, I know that I will never forget the terror that I faced. But I also know that I am stronger for having faced it. I will always remember the lesson that I learned. Sometimes the scariest things are the ones that we can't see. With the last tale still curling your blood, you may think the terror has receded. But beware, the shadows stir again. This next story is ready to wind its way into your nightmares, offering a fresh new chill. My name is Emily, and I recently started my first year of university. I was excited to start this new chapter in my life, but little did I know that this experience would turn out to be nothing like I imagined. It all started when I moved into my dorm room. The room was small and musty, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was my roommate, Ashley. She was unfriendly and always seemed to be hiding something. It wasn't until a few weeks into the semester that I found out what she was hiding. One night, I woke up to a strange noise coming from Ashley's side of the room. I turned on my lamp and saw her sitting up in bed, staring at something on the wall. I asked her what she was doing, but she didn't answer me. Her eyes were fixed on the wall as if she was in a trance. That's when I noticed something moving on the wall. It was a shadowy figure that seemed to be getting bigger and bigger. I tried to wake Ashley up, but she wouldn't budge. The figure grew even larger, and I could see that it was a person with no face. I screamed and ran out of the room as fast as I could. When I got back to my room, Ashley was still sitting there staring at the wall. The figure was gone, but the experience had left me shaken. The next day, I tried to talk to Ashley about what had happened, but she brushed it off like it was nothing. I started to notice more strange things happening around campus. People would disappear without a trace, and strange noises could be heard coming from the old abandoned building on the edge of campus. One night I decided to investigate the abandoned building. As I walked through the dark halls, I heard whispers and footsteps behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. I started to run, but something grabbed my ankle and pulled me back. I fell to the ground, and when I looked up, I saw a group of shadowy figures surrounding me. They had no faces, just like the figure on the wall in my dorm room. I managed to escape, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I started to research the history of the university and found out that it was built on top of an old graveyard. The university had never acknowledged this fact, and rumors had circulated for years about restless spirits haunting the campus. I knew then that I had to do something about it. I started to gather evidence and compile a report to present to the university administration. It wasn't easy, but eventually I convinced them to acknowledge the history of the campus and take steps to appease the spirits. The rest of my time at university was peaceful, but I never forgot the experiences I had. I learned that sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't see, and that sometimes the only way to face our fears is to confront them head on. I never thought that my university experience would turn out to be a nightmare. It all started when I moved into my dorm room. The building was old and creaky, and my room was located on the top floor. It was cramped and musty, and I had to share it with two other students. The worst part was that the room was always cold, no matter how high we turned up the thermostat. Things started to get really strange when I began to hear strange noises at night. At first, I thought it was just the old pipes groaning, but then I started to hear voices. They were whispers at first, but they steadily grew louder until I could make out what they were saying. I tried to ignore them and convince myself that I was just imagining things, but then I started to see things. Shadows would dart across the room, and sometimes I would see strange figures standing in the corner of my vision. When I looked directly at them, they would vanish. I tried to tell my roommates about what I was experiencing, but they just laughed it off. They said that I was just stressed out from classes and needed to relax, but things just kept getting worse. One night, I woke up to see a dark figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was completely still, but I knew that it was staring at me. I tried to scream, but no sound would come out. From that point on, the creature visited me every single night. It would always stand at the foot of my bed, completely motionless. I could feel its eyes on me, and I could sense that it wanted something from me. I started to become obsessed with trying to figure out what the creature was and why it was tormenting me. I spent hours researching the history of the dorm building, trying to find some clue as to what was going on. It was only when I stumbled across an old newspaper article that everything fell into place. The article detailed a grisly murder that had taken place in the dorm building many years ago. A young woman had been brutally killed, and her body had never been found. The article went on to say that after the murder, residents of the building had reported strange noises and sightings of a dark figure. Some even claimed that they had been visited by the ghost of the murdered girl. It was then that I realized what was happening to me. The creature that had been haunting me was the ghost of the murdered girl, and she was seeking revenge on whoever had taken her life. I knew that I had to do something to appease the ghost and put her to rest. I spent the next few days gathering information and eventually discovered the identity of the killer. I went to the police with my evidence, and they were able to track down the killer and bring him to justice. From that point on, the ghost stopped visiting me, and I was finally able to get some sleep. My university experience had been a nightmare, but it had also taught me a valuable lesson. Sometimes, the past can come back to haunt you, and it's up to you to confront it head on. I've always been fascinated by the paranormal. As a child, I would watch ghost hunting shows and read books about haunted places. So when I started university, I was excited to hear rumors about a haunted building on campus. The building was an old library that had been converted into offices for the university staff. The stories ranged from sightings of a ghostly figure on the top floor to strange noises coming from the basement. It didn't take long for me to convince a group of friends to join me on an investigation. We planned the investigation for a Friday night when most of the staff would be gone. Armed with flashlights and recording equipment, we made our way to the building. As soon as we entered, we could feel a chill in the air. The old books and dusty furniture added to the eerie atmosphere. We started on the top floor and worked our way down, checking every room for any signs of paranormal activity. But it wasn't until we reached the basement that things started to get really creepy. As soon as we stepped into the basement, we heard a strange humming sound. It was low and rhythmic, but it seemed to be coming from all around us. We tried to dismiss it as just the building settling, but the sound only grew louder. We continued to explore the basement, and that's when we saw her. A young woman was standing at the end of the hall, her long hair covering her face. We called out to her, but she didn't respond. As we got closer, she turned and disappeared into one of the rooms. We followed her into the room, but it was empty. The humming sound was still there, but now it seemed to be coming from the walls. We started to feel uneasy, like something was watching us. That's when we heard the scream. It was loud and piercing, coming from one of the nearby rooms. We rushed to the source of the sound and found ourselves in a small, cramped storage room. There was another scream, and this time we could see where it was coming from. A young woman was lying on the ground, her body contorted in pain. She was clutching her stomach, and blood was seeping through her shirt. We called for help and waited with the girl until the paramedics arrived. She was rushed to the hospital, but we never found out what happened to her. After that night, we never went back to the haunted building. But the experience stayed with me, haunting me like the ghost we had encountered. I still wonder about the young woman we saw and what happened to her. I never imagined that my university experience would be as terrifying as it was. When I first started, I was excited to finally be free from the strict rules of high school and to be able to explore my passions. However, things quickly took a turn for the worse. It all started when I joined a new club on campus. It was a small group of students who were interested in paranormal activities and exploring abandoned buildings. I thought it would be a fun way to spend my weekends, exploring old buildings with like-minded individuals. But I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Our first exploration was an old abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. As soon as we stepped inside, I could feel a sense of unease. The air was thick with dust, and the only sounds we could hear were our own footsteps. We made our way through the halls, stopping to investigate any strange noises or movements we encountered. It wasn't until we reached the basement that things truly took a turn for the worse. We found a room filled with old medical equipment and a metal table in the center. As we were looking around, we heard a noise coming from one of the nearby rooms. We cautiously approached the door and peered inside, only to be met with the sight of a figure in a white lab coat hunched over a desk. We were all frozen in fear, not knowing what to do. The figure slowly turned its head and looked directly at us, revealing a grotesque face with twisted features. It let out a blood-curdling scream and charged at us. We ran as fast as we could, not stopping until we were outside of the building. We were all shaken by the experience and decided to call it a day. But that was only the beginning. The more we explored, the more we encountered strange and terrifying things. We found a room filled with old dolls that seemed to move on their own, a deserted library that had books flying off the shelves, and even a hidden basement filled with human bones. I tried to leave the group multiple times, but I was always pulled back in by the thrill of the unknown. It wasn't until our last exploration that I realized what we were really dealing with. We had decided to explore an old mental asylum on the outskirts of town. As soon as we stepped inside, we could feel a sense of dread that we had never experienced before. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the only sounds we could hear were our own racing heartbeats. As we made our way through the halls, we began to hear voices and whispers in our ears. Shadows started to move on the walls, and I could feel something cold and clammy brush against my skin. We eventually found ourselves in a small room with a single chair in the center. We could hear someone breathing heavily in the darkness, but we couldn't see anything. Suddenly, the chair spun around, revealing a figure with glowing eyes and razor-sharp teeth. We all screamed and ran for the exit, not stopping until we were outside. As we caught our breath, we realized that we had all been marked with strange symbols on our skin. I left the group that day, never looking back. But the memories of those experiences still haunt me to this day. I can't help but wonder what else is lurking in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. It was my freshman year in college, and I was excited to finally be on my own. I moved into my dorm room and met my roommate, Sarah. She seemed nice enough, but there was something off about her. She had dark circles under her eyes and always looked tired. The first few weeks of classes were a blur. I was trying to keep up with all the new material and making new friends. But something strange was happening on campus. People were disappearing, and nobody knew why. The university sent out emails warning students to be careful and not go out alone at night. One evening, Sarah and I were studying in our room when we heard a knock at the door. It was our neighbor, Marcy, asking if we wanted to go to a party. Sarah declined, saying she had a headache and needed to rest. I decided to go, figuring I could use a break from studying. The party was in a rundown house on the outskirts of campus. The music was loud and the air was thick with the smell of alcohol. I was having a good time until I noticed that Marcy was nowhere to be found. I asked around, but nobody had seen her. Feeling uneasy, I decided to leave and head back to my dorm room. As I walked back, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around but saw nobody. I started walking faster and so did the footsteps. I broke into a run and the footsteps turned into a chase. When I finally made it back to my dorm room, I was out of breath and shaking. Sarah was still in bed, but I could tell she wasn't sleeping. I told her what happened, and she just looked at me with a blank expression. The next day, Marcy was still missing. The university had called in the police to investigate. Sarah and I stayed in our dorm room, afraid to leave. That's when I noticed something strange about Sarah. Her eyes had turned a dark shade of red, and her skin was starting to peel. I screamed, and Sarah lunged at me. I managed to run out of the room and into the hallway, but Sarah was hot on my heels. I ran down the stairs and out of the building, never looking back. The police later found out that Sarah had been possessed by a demon. She had been performing rituals in our room and was planning on sacrificing me to the demon. I was lucky to have escaped with my life. From that day on, I never took my university experiences for granted. I learned to trust my instincts and be careful who I let into my life. I never believed in ghosts until I started college. It was my first semester, and I was living in a dorm that was rumored to be haunted. I didn't pay much attention to it at first, but strange things started happening that I couldn't explain. It started with a tapping noise at night. I would hear it coming from the walls, and it sounded like someone was trying to get my attention. I thought it was just the pipes or something, but it persisted every night. Then I started seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, like someone was watching me. It made me feel uneasy and paranoid. One night, I was studying for a midterm when the tapping noise started again. I got up to investigate, but as soon as I stood up, the room went silent. I shrugged it off and went back to my desk. But then, I felt something brush against my leg. I looked down and there was nothing there. I tried to ignore it and focus on my studies, but then the tapping started up again. This time, it was louder and more persistent. I decided to confront whatever was causing the noise and turned around. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure was standing in the corner of my room watching me. It was tall and dark, and its eyes glowed red in the dim light. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was like I was frozen in place. The figure started to move towards me, and that's when I finally found my voice and screamed. The next thing I knew, my dorm mates were banging on my door trying to wake me up. Apparently, I had passed out and was screaming in my sleep. I tried to shrug it off and tell them it was nothing, but I knew deep down that something wasn't right. After that night, things only got worse. The figure started appearing more frequently, and I could hear whispers in the night. I was getting paranoid and scared, and it was affecting my studies and my mental health. I finally confided in one of my professors, who told me something that made my blood run cold. The dorm I was living in used to be a psychiatric hospital in the 1920s. The patients were mistreated and left to suffer in terrible conditions. Some of them died there, and their spirits never left. The tapping noise, the shadows, the figure in my room, they were all manifestations of the past. I couldn't take it anymore. I moved out of the dorm and sought help from a therapist. It took me a long time to recover from the trauma, but I eventually graduated and moved on with my life. I was a freshman at a prestigious university, filled with excitement and anticipation for the new experiences that awaited me. I had always been a studious and diligent student, and the thought of studying in one of the top universities in the country was a dream come true. But as the days went by, I began to realize that university life was far from what I had imagined. The workload was overwhelming and the pressure to excel was immense. I barely had any time for myself, let alone to explore the city or make friends. But that wasn't the worst of it. Something strange began to happen to me. I started to experience vivid nightmares that left me terrorized and exhausted. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat and with a feeling of dread that stayed with me for hours. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to stress and exhaustion, but the nightmares only got worse. It was as if they were trying to tell me something, trying to warn me about a danger that I couldn't see. One night, as I lay in bed trying to calm my racing heart, I heard a strange noise coming from outside. It sounded like someone or something was scratching at my door. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, but the scratching grew louder and more persistent. I mustered up the courage to get out of bed and investigate, but what I found was beyond my wildest nightmares. There, standing outside my door, was a figure that looked like a distorted version of myself. Its eyes were black pits, and its skin was sallow and rotting. It reached out a bony, clawed hand towards me, and I screamed in terror. The figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, but the memory of it stayed with me. I tried to tell myself that it was just a hallucination, but deep down, I knew that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't until I met with a local paranormal investigator that I learned the truth. The university that I was studying at was built on top of a burial ground, and the spirits of the dead were angry and restless. They were trying to warn me about the dangers that awaited me if I continued to stay there. With the help of the investigator, I was able to perform a ritual to appease the spirits and make peace with the past. The nightmares stopped, and I was able to continue my studies without fear. But the memory of that night stayed with me, a reminder that sometimes the things that scare us the most are the ones that are the most real.